Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Michael Regina. I am the author and illustrator of the all-ages horror graphic novel, The Sleepover, available wherever books are sold, and as well as my self-published series, Adamsville. And in this series, this is my Deepwater Creek production diary series of videos in which I talk to you a little bit about the new book I'm working on, my process in making it, whether it be the art, the production, or the writing side of things. And in this specific video, I want to talk to you about the idea of theme. I want to talk to you about stories and their themes, how to find one, why they're important, and the journey I took to actually discover the theme on this story. So if you're like me, you probably have come up with an idea for a story. You're like, that is an awesome idea for a story. I really want to tell the story about an alien invasion and this family that's trapped in the middle of it and how they survive. And that idea gets you excited. And you begin fleshing everything out, and you can't wait to draw these awesome fight scenes and these big invasion monsters or whatever the heck it is that you're working on. And then you sit down to write it, and you're like, this is just a bunch of weird events happening and really nothing that makes the story meaningful or purposeful or like, why would anyone care, right? And that's why and where theme comes in. Theme is why a story matters. So what I want to do is talk to you about how do you find your theme, what it is, and why it's so important, and ways that you can connect a theme back to your story. So real quick, we're going to start off with the idea of what is a story's theme. The story's theme, as I just mentioned, is sort of the internal conflict of the story, the internal message or lesson that your character needs to learn as they journey from point A to point B through a story through the external conflict of it. The external conflict of something like The Sleepover, my book, is sort of twofold. You have this loss of a loved one through Ruby, and then you have this new external conflict of the new nanny, who the kids begin to suspect is a monster or a witch from local legend. So they have this external conflict of a group of kids having a sleepover party trapped inside of a house with a woman that they believe is a witch. That's a fun external conflict. I loved that conflict. I was like, man, I can't wait to tell that story and come up with all these cool ideas that involve a witch being inside of a house, terrorizing these children, and the kids eventually fighting back to win the day. But I couldn't tell that story yet because I couldn't figure out why this story mattered. What was it that I wanted to say through this story? I was driving to the DMV one day thinking about this idea of a group of kids having a sleepover party with a witch inside the house or a monster when I remembered something from my own childhood. Up to this point, this story was just sort of generic kids trapped inside of a house, monster, whatever. And then I remembered from my childhood this connection of losing a nanny that we loved, also named Ruby. And I started thinking about, man, that would be a really interesting backdrop to that. And what would I want to say through this story about that? But if it would have just been this external conflict of a group of kids fighting monsters, I don't really know that the story would have landed with people, I think, the way that it seems to have for so many. Because eventually this story dovetailed into being a story about learning to deal with loss and grief, and ultimately the theme that I think the story is all about and that I hinged everything upon was this idea of when we go through difficult times, we need to be there for one another and support one another so that we can get through it together. And then I manufacture everything within the story to hold on to that theme. And that's why theme is so important. It connects the threads of everything that happens in the external plot to the things that are happening to your character's internal struggles. So how do you find it? How do you find your theme to your story? This is where I think a lot of people struggle because they either undervalue it or overthink it. And I'm here to just maybe offer a few thoughts on how you might do this. One very helpful way I've heard people discover their theme is that they actually spend a lot of time thinking about, what is it that I want to say? What is it that my character is dealing with? Or that I would love to shout from the rooftops as a truth to all people? Let me give you an example of how this might work. I want to take the idea of The Boy Who Cried Wolf, for instance. So in the story, The Boy Who Cried Wolf, you've got a boy who is constantly telling people that a wolf is attacking them. People show up trying to rescue him, and they realize, wait, this isn't happening. He's not telling the truth. People begin to suspect this kid's a liar. And eventually they stop listening to him when he's crying wolf. And so to the point when he actually needs help, nobody comes because he's been lying the whole time. Obviously, the truth of this story is tell the truth, because if you don't, others won't believe you when it matters the most. This is such an important lesson. I think that this story could have been found in a couple of ways. If I were thinking about it in one school of thought, it might be, I would say, I want to talk about the idea of being a trustworthy person. So if I can start with this key idea of, I want to talk about being trustworthy. And this is maybe before I've come up with anything, any sort of plot idea, any sort of monsters or adventure or any sort of external conflict. I know that the truth of the story is going to be, I want to tell a story about a person who struggles with telling the truth and learns the importance of it. So that tells me actually a few things. I need a character that struggles with telling the truth. I need to show them wrestling with trustworthiness. And at some point in the story, someone probably early on is going to tell this person, hey, your lying is going to get you in trouble. No one's going to care anymore when you really need it. And then over the course of my story, I'm going to show how that truth plays out, right? So I could start with this nugget of beginning with this idea of, I know what I want to say, and then I start thinking about what are all the elements I need to include to actually make that work. And I have found that I don't work well that way. I get the logic of it, because what it does for you is that it so often answers a lot of your questions. If you do know what you're trying to say about it in a story, you can often work backwards, right? So I can say, well, like I just gave this example, I want to talk about being truthworthy. So I'm going to show a character who struggles with that. So I know my main character needs to struggle with trustworthiness. I know I'm going to need to show my character struggling with being trustworthy. And I know at the end of the day, that lack of trustworthiness is going to cost them something, where other people have to, where that person has lost the trust of others and is therefore in trouble because of that lack of trust. I haven't even mentioned anything about wolves or anything at this point. I've just mentioned what I know needs to occur to do that. So in one sense, starting with this can be very efficient because it answers a lot of the questions for you early. What I found, though, is I often don't know what it is I want to say just yet. What I often want to do, or what often strikes me, is an idea, a what if, a question of like, what is this cool thing that has gotten me excited? Like with the sleepover, this idea of a group of kids trapped inside of a house with a monster really intrigued me. And then I mulled over that idea for a long time, trying to answer the question, well, if I'm telling that story, what sort of characters can I insert in there that would make some sense? So I knew that I wanted a young kid. I knew that that boy was going to be the main character of the story, but I wasn't quite sure what the thrust of the story was going to be. And over time, I began to come up with this theme of loss and grief and so on. And then once I had that realization, I was able to work backwards to reinforce that theme throughout different elements of my story. I can say that this is not necessarily the most efficient way to work because it does involve a lot of backtracking. That said, I think a lot of us come to stories that way. We get excited about an external conflict that gets us pumped about telling our story, and therefore we try to work backwards from that. So how do you find it in this instance? Well, I think the way it can often work is that I knew, like Deepwater Creek, for instance, I knew that I wanted to tell, I was sort of blessed in the sense that for Deepwater Creek, the two ideas came to me a little bit hand in hand, but it still took a long way to land on ultimately what I think I wanted to say. The early idea for Deepwater Creek centered around an illness within my family and me wrestling with that illness and not knowing how to help somebody, how to support them, and wanting desperately for like this magical cure that if we just found that cure, everything would be better and we could just be better. So I had this idea, this vision of friends going on this journey to help rescue someone who is sick by catching this magical fish, right? Like we'll capture this magical fish will heal my brother, and then that will be this amazing journey of like discovering life and learning to confront our fears head on and yada, 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 yada. it really became a story about learning to confront fear and seeing like good results from having confronted that fear. As I wrote this story over time, that theme felt so hollow to me. One, because a lot of it felt like I was lecturing the person who was sick rather than talking about the person who represented me, which is the character Wade. The character that represents me, Wade, is the person struggling to understand that sometimes you can't fix the problem yourself. Sometimes you can't push somebody to fix something. Sometimes you have to accept that you are powerless in the face of something and learn to be there anyways. You can't change people's hearts. You can't change their fear. You can't fix all their problems. So how in the world do you be there for them? And that took me about a good 2 years of writing to fully understand. But why this is so important and why you have to stick to that theme, that idea of the theme, and stick to it and pound it into the pavement until you figured it out, is because once you figure that thing out, it begins to knock down all these dominoes all the way down the line. So as soon as I realized that this story was about learning to accept what you can't control and be there anyways, it enabled me to look back through my story and go, where can I either show this theme expanded through my characters, or show their inability to, or you maybe show how people have a bad view of that, how people sometimes run away from problems, or people try to force a fix to a problem, or whatever the case might be. Once I had that, I could then start sprinkling those things in my story and going backwards. This is why a theme does need to be something that you think a lot about, because regardless of where you come up with it, it will inform so many of the things that happen within your story. It can't just be a throwaway mention. It can't just be a thing that you just like, well, that happened. If you can figure it out, spend the time with it, you can land on some really, truly great results. For instance, within The Sleepover, once I realized that this book was all about being for other people who are going through grief, I began working that backwards through the story. So you will notice a thread involving the character of Matthew and Judy, his sister Judy. After they go through this loss, Matthew withdraws himself. He doesn't connect with his sister any longer. He just wants to be alone. Other people are trying to connect with him, but he doesn't really want that connection. And most explicably, he pushes his sister away. He doesn't want anything to do with her. And she so desperately wants her brother and the comfort of her brother. And I tried to show how that break in their friendship and their relationship eventually leads to a final conflict within the story, involving how him pushing her away and not being there for her really hurt and wounded her in a way that he needed to learn this lesson of, I have done something wrong. I retreated within my own fear and my own grief, and I didn't help my sister. And I think it leads to a really powerful climax within the story as Matthew begins to wrestle with this problem. And I'm doing the same sort of thing in Deepwater Creek. I'm working backwards through a bunch of, as I've realized this theme, I've rewritten my ending. I've rewritten certain scenes to sort of sprinkle in more understanding of this theme. But it took me a long time to get there. So I guess the gist of this is not simply to say to you, oh, it's so easy, you guys. Oh my gosh, I cannot stand writing advice. We're like, oh, it's so easy. If you can just figure it out, everything's so easy. Writing is hard work. You got to stick with the problem. And I think sticking with this idea of the theme early and often will help solve so many problems. Now, within the example of Deepwater Creek, it's a little bit unique in the sense that I was writing a story about an internal thing that I was learning. Oftentimes, I'm writing about a story that has something to do with a situation that either happened in my distant past or is just a general truth that I care a whole lot about. But this book was sort of a form of therapy for me, a way of me coping with very present and real problems that I was dealing with. And I was struggling with finding my theme in this story because I felt like I hadn't learned the lesson that these events were teaching me. And once I felt like I had learned that lesson, it was easier for me to say, yep, that is what this book is about. I'm going backwards and I'm reinstilling it. That's one of the cool things about storytelling in general and theme, is that it gives you an opportunity to sort of work out your own demons so you can go backwards and flesh these things out that matter to you and work through some sort of problem and probably come out on the other end of it renewed and refreshed and feeling like you have a healthy perspective on new things. So I definitely recommend sticking with your theme as much as you can, and you'll learn a ton from it. There's a great book that I want to recommend in closing on this subject called Story Genius. This book really dives into this idea of discovering your theme. The author reinforces a lot of principles that I learned through another author named Brian McDonald. And this idea of once you can figure out what your theme is, it does begin to answer a lot of questions for you. But what I think she does a great job of is tying it back to this idea of, well, maybe I started with an external what if question or an external conflict, and I want to work backwards from there. How do I do that? It's a great book. I definitely recommend checking it out. There's a link in the description below for you to check it out. But I also highly recommend Brian McDonald and Jesse Bryant's video on your armature. He talks at length about this, about how do you discover the theme of your story. I'll put that link in the description below. So I hope this was in some way helpful. Theme is a difficult topic, but what I mostly wanted to convey to you is that it's so important for you to stick with it and discover your theme, know what you have to say, and if you know what it is that you're trying to say, you can sort of work backwards to bring that theme into your story and make decisions that reinforce that decision so that your story really sings. The goal for me is that I want someone to put down my book and say, man, that was a lot of fun, but I have something I really need to think about. That to me is like the pinnacle of I did a good job. I want you to have a lot of fun, but also have something to think about. And discovering your theme and working out that internal conflict piece is so important. And if in general you want to learn more about my writing process or how I write, check out this video that I made discussing my top 3 favorite writing books. I think you might find something really useful in them. So thanks for hanging out with this video, a little bit of a longer one. I hope you enjoyed it, and more to come next time. I'll see you all. Bye.